I want to thank Mary Catherine and Valerie Bowman for all their encouragement and their patience, and for everybody who put together this service. I thought has been excellent from the readings, and I'm definitely voting for Mouse, given it a chance. I'm also very grateful to live in a country where free thought and expression is still allowed, even though it's not always encouraged, particularly in our current polarized environment. My first personal experience with political polarization occurred 4 years ago. In the span of about 2 weeks, I was called a homophobe by a Democratic activist, presumably because I was then a Republican candidate for Congress. And I was called something worse by Republican activists because of my support for same-sex marriage. What I think is particularly interesting about that story is that I was stereotyped by both sides about the same issue. One, about what a Republican candidate must be. He must clearly be a homophobe. And two, what a Republican candidate should be. He should be against same-sex marriage. So if you haven't gathered already, this talk is going to be expressly about politics, but I do not intend it to be political. It's not partisan. I'm not going to be taking a side. I'm going to be talking about how we can improve our politics writ large, particularly at the most fundamental level, which is as each of us as individuals. In fact, as Mary Catherine already alluded to, I am volunteering as the state coordinator for a group called renamed Braver Angels now, for the past year and a half. And most of my time outside of family and work is dedicated in one way or another towards improving our politics. This talk is divided into two portions. The first portion is titled Where We Are, and the second portion is How We Move Forward. In the first portion, I hope to convince you, if you aren't already, that we've got some serious problems we need to address. And in the second portion, I'll talk about some skills, particularly regarding communication and trust, how we can begin to move forward. I'm very concerned about the state of our nation, but I remain stubbornly optimistic that we will prevail. As Winston Churchill is said to have reported about Americans, that we can always be trusted to do the right thing once all other possibilities have been exhausted. There's actually no proof that he said that, but it's a great story, and it rings true to me. I actually think we have two problems. We have a system problem and a people problem. The system problem is our political infrastructure, one that promotes two viable parties only, one that emphasizes fundraising and campaigning over legislating, one that resists transparency and accountability, and in the process promotes pandering to supporters, vilifying the opposition, and ignoring pretty much everyone else. For decades, multiple studies have shown that the average American is not well served by legislation or regulation coming out of Washington. Business interests, the wealthy, and special interest groups do quite well, but the average American, not so much. And this has been true regardless of which political party has held power. I hope this will be available on the website. I put together a resources page of readings and groups you might consider being involved in. One of those is an excellent study that came out of the Harvard Business School titled Why Competition in the Politics Industry is Failing America. If you just do an online search for that title, you can find a free PDF of that report, videos, podcasts, and even a recently released book. It's a wonderful starting point. I highly encourage you to read it. Basically, the authors point out that the only winners in our current system are those politicians who can play the game well enough to prevail over their opponent at the ballot box, and two, what the authors call the political industrial complex, which supports both sides in those efforts. That political industrial complex includes campaign consultants, pollsters, fundraisers, big money donors, special interests, lobbyists, and others. There are dozens of organizations which are working to effect meaningful political change, including addressing things like campaign finance reform, promoting open primaries, and ranked choice voting, and a host of other efforts. Again, I have resources that if you are interested in some of these organizations, you can check them out, literally dozens. But the truth is, our system won't change until a sizable, and this is key, a politically diverse swath of the population demands it. Right, center, and left. And that's really, I think, where we have a people problem. Our people problem is a communication problem. Because of political polarization, it's very difficult to have reasonable and meaningful conversations with those on the other side, and sometimes with those on our own side. I've already shared my personal anecdote about being called a homophobe and something worse, but I'm a science guy, so I kind of like data. What do the graphs show? Has polarization been getting worse? Regular polling by Pew Research tracks political ideology among active Republicans and Democratic voters. This first slide is from 1994, and where you can see there are differences between the two parties. That's really not a surprise. There'd be no reason to have two parties if you didn't have differences of opinion. But note that the median voters are not too far apart, and that there is a tremendous overlap, that big purple section, between the two groups. If we move forward 20 years to 2014, we can see a remarkable change. Both parties have moved far to the left and right. The median Democratic and median Republican voters in particular are far apart, and there's very little overlap anymore. That center has been largely hollowed out. And note that this was 2 years before the divisive 2016 election. An additional 4 years have passed since that election. I have no data, but little doubt that the polarization has gotten worse. Ongoing polling from Gallup, if that slide's going to pop up, reveals self-identification of Americans by party. And I think we're coming. Oh, maybe not yet. There we go. And over the last 3 decades, what we see is a steady decline in popularity of the Republicans and Democrats. You can especially follow that with the trend lines, the dashed straight trend lines. Meanwhile, a steady rise in those who identify with neither party. That is the hollowed out and largely ignored center of our body politic today. That's number is now over 40%, 45% was the last number I saw. As a businessman, I would see that as a market growth opportunity, but as a person who's concerned about the future of our country, I think it's a sign that our current political system is not serving us well, and that's a very bad place to be for our country. So data is useful, but can be dry for many people. I think we are oftentimes more aware of political divisions on a more visceral level, and photographs do a good job of showing those divisions at a gut level. The following 2 photographs are both from 2017, the first from Charlottesville, that Unite the Right rally, which left 1 dead, and the second from Berkeley, a reaction on the other side against some right protesters. I could have updated both slides from photos from this year, but I think these are pretty iconic. I like to note that "Become Ungovernable" banner at the back, in the background of that last slide, because that's exactly where we're headed unless we improve unless we change course. The problem is not simply that we have differences of opinion regarding policy, or even broader philosophic differences about the nature and role of government. No, the problem is that we've felt those differences be felt emotionally, justifying dismissal or even hatred of the other side. Researchers sometimes call this affective polarization, in which we no longer have negative opinions of the views of those on the other side, but negative opinions of those people themselves. Especially among the most active partisans on both sides, they are likely to view the other side as not merely wrong, but as stupid, dangerous, or evil. The result is that rather than engaging in constructive arguments, we dismiss the other side as deplorables, as snowflakes, as Nazis or Marxists, as racist or elitist. We have made, in my lifetime, great strides in promoting toleration and celebrating diversity when it comes to ethnicity, religion, gender, But where we are failing badly is in the realm of political thought. With rare exception, you do not see people calling for a celebration of political diversity or for the toleration of political views other than their own. As with any complex problem, the causes are multifactorial and they tend to reinforce one another. Our media, social and conventional, is one factor. Our news sources used to be very limited. Now they seem nearly endless. And so now we can search out those media sources that tell us basically what we already want to hear. So while we once consumed the media to inform our views, we now consume it to affirm our views. And then as we self-segregate according to news source, the media responds in turn by shifting further to the left and right. They're pandering to their audience, right? And as they do so, that leads to further polarization in each of us. Similarly, as Washington continues to fail us, then we lose trust in the federal government, and we feel a need to blame someone. The other side is the obvious but wrong scapegoat. The good news is this cycle can be broken. It's entirely within our power to do so. Pictured are two of my good friends, Christian and Anthony. Anthony has the curlier hair. In 2016, Christian and Anthony were both students at Graceland University in Lamoni, Iowa. Christian was the chair of the College Republicans and Anthony was chair of the College Democrats on campus. And they were roommates. During that divisive 2016 year, they watched all the debates. They disagreed on any number of issues, but they remained roommates and became very good friends. They went to one of their professors and said, how can we take what we have found to our campus? As it turned out, that professor had recently read an article about Better Angels, which is a national organization we'll talk about. And so in the process, Christian and Anthony were the first to bring Better Angels to Iowa, and in turn, me to Better Angels. Christian and Anthony are living proof to me of what is possible in the ideas which follow. So how do we move forward? How do we leave behind an America worth inheriting? Well, as any 12-step help program will say, the first step is to admit we have a problem, and I think we do, but in this case, we're not powerless in the face of it. So again, do we have a problem? Yes, I think we do. We have a broken political system that benefits a select few, not average Americans. Our political polarization makes it difficult for us to find any solutions to include fixing that broken political system. I find that incivility in the public sphere disheartening and hateful, and I think that ignoring a large swath of Americans, that ignored middle, is unfair and unwise. I believe that the only way we can hope to fix things is by doing it ourselves. A result of any given election is not going to change us. This is something we have to do. Meaningful and sustainable change is possible, but it has to start at the grassroots level. And again, consisting of a politically diverse group of stakeholders committed to that change. In other words, what would Anthony and Christian do? What groups like Braver Angels and Living Room Conversation Project do is facilitate communication. We do this through a series of different workshops, and we can't go through that exhaustively here today, but I'd like to point out a few basic skills. I think there are three main skills to communicating, those being thinking, listening, and speaking, and we'll go over those briefly in turn. Good thinking skills are the bedrock to communication because they determine how we listen and speak. Knowing what we believe and how we reason is absolutely critical. Here it is helpful to have a healthy dose of humility. Realize that we are all fallible. We are all prone to erroneous beliefs and making snap judgments. One particularly common mistake when it comes to politics is to believe the very best of my side and the very worst of the other. Jesus' warning against judging others is particularly applicable here, such as in his parable about the mote and the beam. But in this case, I think both sides have pretty big logs in their eyes. Another common mistake is in the processing of new information. Do we too readily accept it if it agrees with what we already believe? And are we hypercritical of that information if it disagrees with something we already believe? It's difficult to do, but we should try to be just as critical of information we agree with as that which we don't. And we should try to find areas of agreement, even with those viewpoints that are different than our own. In Jonathan Haidt's book, The Righteous Mind, he mentions a parable of the elephant and the rider. In this parable, the elephant is our beliefs, what we do, what we think, how we act, based on emotion or intuition. And the rider is our reason, how we justify our actions, the beliefs by the elephant. And his argument is that much of what we believe is based upon intuition or emotion rather than reasoning it all out. And I think this is true. If you ask people on the right or the left, most people will have an opinion on climate change, for example. But very few have actually read a climate change report from the IPCC. In the parable, our rationality again is the rider, our beliefs are the elephant. The elephant goes where it wants to go based upon intuition or emotion, and we use our reason to justify our beliefs or where the elephant is taking us. I think a lot of the time, Haidt is right about that. This is one of my favorite quotes. I think my mom used to say this. We don't actually know where it comes from. It's probably a parable lost in time, but it's been variously attributed to Epictetus and Diogenes. The one researcher found the earliest citation to Zeno. But I think the point here is not so much the quantity of time as the quality of time, or quality of our efforts to both listening and speaking. Probably one of the most common mistakes we all make is listening to rebut rather than listening to understand. I think we all know what this means. It means that at some point, rather than just actively listening to the speaker, trying to understand what they have to say, we are formulating our response. And that response is not always a rebuttal, but sometimes it's just, oh, we want to share a funny anecdote, or we want to shift the direction of the conversation because maybe it's getting uncomfortable. Regardless of the reason why, we have stopped listening at that point. So along with humility, recognizing we are all fallible in our beliefs, we should also remember that we are all valuable and that we all have important things to say, even sometimes those people with whom we disagree, because new perspectives and insights is really how we move knowledge forward. Another common error is listening to find differences rather than common ground. I had an experience with this just a couple months ago. Well, you have them all the time, but one particularly stood out. I was talking to someone about some area of economic reform, and she asked me to explain myself further, specifically saying, hey, we may have some areas of common ground. I explained my views, and she disagreed with my views. So in truth, she wasn't really seeking common ground between us, but just trying to see if I agreed with her. In fairness to my friend, this occurred on social media where lots of communication goes to die. The last skill is speaking skill. And I think that it's really difficult, particularly on contentious subjects like politics. Most of us make some of the following mistakes, sometimes only occasionally, but sometimes quite often. One is to make true statements rather than belief statements. What I mean here is that saying what you believe to be true is one thing. It leaves open room for discussion. If you just say that this is the truth and you got to agree with me or not, shuts down line of communication. For example, if we return back to climate change and I were to say that I believe that a carbon tax and dividend system might be a good way to address climate change, I've left open an avenue for discussion. If, however, I say, studies are clear that climate change must happen and will work, I potentially shut down any avenue for further communication unless my listener is particularly forgiving. Another speaking error is asking the wrong kinds of questions. Questions of understanding are genuine efforts to better understand who you're listening to, as opposed to gotcha questions, which are purposely intended to put the speaker on the defensive. For example, beating your wife. Are you still beating your wife now is a classic comedic example. But for going back to climate change, if I were to present an argument on behalf of a carbon tax and dividend, and the reply I got was, so you're a socialist now? That is a gotcha question that, again, shuts down any further communication. Great quote from Abraham Lincoln. And Abe didn't always like everyone, but he was well known as making an effort to get to know them. And I think that's basically where we need to start. It's very simple. Such efforts to get to know people we might disagree with are usually fruitful in my experience, and they can be a lot of fun. Going back to Christian and Anthony, we were at an event at Grayson University a year ago. We were having a Better Angels event. And in particular, we were having what is called a red-blue workshop, in which case we bring together roughly equal numbers of reds, conservatives, blues, liberals, or progressives together to have a structured conversation. Included in that group were two people, one on each side, who had a very strong Christian faith that underlined their political beliefs. The blue Christian, a retired professor from Simpson College, his big issue was climate change and the environment. The red Christian kind of had traditional conservative social issues, but likewise justifying her positions based upon her Christian faith. We were actually a little concerned there might be a confrontation there, but very early on in the meeting, I just simply pointed out that I thought it was very interesting that both of them had strong Christian faiths and that underpinned their political beliefs. That was all it took. Some common ground was established, and from there, they actually found other areas of agreement. So it oftentimes takes very little. The retired professor, by the way, has become a good friend of mine since. He now refers to me as his favorite Republican, even though I'm now registered independent. He asked me to ride with his team on RAGBRAI last summer, which I did, and I would have done so again this year if that ride hadn't been canceled. In conclusion, I think it's really important to realize that if we go around thinking alike all the time, it's not very interesting, and it's also not a good way to move things forward. So I encourage you strongly to get out and try outside of your comfort level. Who knows what you might find? If you're on the political left, which I think probably most of the people in this audience are, maybe go to that house in the neighborhood that has a Trump sign out front, or buy a beer for the guy with the MAGA hat in the bar. If you're on the political right, strike up a conversation with the woman still proudly wearing her Warren t-shirt, or have a cup of coffee with the guy at Starbucks with a Biden sticker on his laptop. I invite each of you to become Better Angels members, Braver Angels, and or to get involved with any of the other organizations that are mentioned on the resources page. And let's begin to work together to affect meaningful change. We can only do that together, and I think it is possible, and our time to do so is now. Remember, lastly, we are all fallible, so be humble as regard your own beliefs. Remember, we are all valuable, so be respectful of the beliefs of others. And lastly, let's realize we are all responsible for leaving behind an America worth inheriting for future generations. Thank you so much for your time.